Hello, my name is Hugh Ford. I'm a registered migration agent. I'm also a solicitor, but I deal principally with migration matters. Now, today I'm going to talk to you about applying for a protection visa and also having to go to the Refugee Review Tribunal. I'm going to concentrate more on the Refugee Review Tribunal and how to go about it, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Now, most of the time when people go to the Migration Review Tribunal, or in this case the Refugee Review Tribunal, they've applied for a protection visa and they've been refused. Now, invariably, when you get to the Refugee Review Tribunal, they should deal with the whole matter afresh. They can't just look at the previous decision of the government and decide whether that's a good decision or not. They have to look at the whole decision afresh and make a new decision as to whether you satisfy the criteria or not. Now, invariably, if you're an applicant for a protection visa, you've been claiming that you've been the subject of persecution, and really the Refugee Review Tribunal should be looking at the acts of persecution in order to decide whether you were in fact persecuted or not. So the tribunal should be asking you questions like, you said you were walking down the street, which street was it, what happened, who attacked you, did anyone see you being attacked, all those sorts of questions about the acts of persecution. But in reality, that's not whatever happens in front of the Refugee Review Tribunal. They never even bother to ask you questions about that, because as soon as they start asking questions about that, it'll become abundantly clear that you were persecuted and they'll have to grant you the visa. The Refugee Review Tribunal doesn't want to grant you the visa. The starting point for the Refugee Review Tribunal is no. And what you've got to do is convince them to yes. They are of the view that you are not a refugee, and you need to convince them that you are a refugee. Now, the UN Convention on Refugees states this quite clearly, that the presumption is in favour that you are a refugee until there's something to the contrary. But in the Refugee Review Tribunal, it's the exact opposite, and that's why they always act unlawfully, because the starting point for the Refugee Review Tribunal is you're not a refugee, and you have to now convince the tribunal that you are a refugee. So it's most unfair on you, because it's very hard to prove that you are a refugee. Invariably, you're not going to have a record of someone attacking you or punching the living daylights out of you or beating you with a stick. No one's going to keep a record of how they assaulted you, so it's very hard for you to prove that you are in fact a refugee. But nevertheless, that's how the Refugee Review Tribunal conducts its business. You've got to convince them. Even though it's wrong and they shouldn't be doing it, that's the way they operate. Now, the other thing, as I've already indicated, that Refugee Review Tribunal should be asking you questions about the acts of persecution, but that's not what happens. Instead, what happens is they will ask you a whole myriad of silly, irrelevant questions, like what school you went to, where you lived in Zimbabwe, what's the name of your parents, names of sisters, what high school you went to, whether you went to hospital, all those sorts of issues, which really are irrelevant. Now, I've represented many people in the Refugee Review Tribunal, and invariably we have this whole host of silly questions which should not be asked. But they will ask you these questions, and it's got to the stage now where I simply refuse to answer these questions because they're not relevant to the issue that's before the tribunal, and the issue that's before the tribunal is whether you are the subject of persecution. So if you go to the Refugee Review Tribunal and they say to you, look, what's your mother's maiden name, or what school did you go to? then ask the tribunal, how is this relevant to the act of persecution, and get them to explain it. If they can give you a good explanation, then give an answer. If they refuse, if they won't give you a good explanation, then don't answer the question. Say, this isn't relevant, and I'm not going to answer that question. Now, the tribunal, the Refugee Review Tribunal, instead of asking you the right sorts of questions, ask you the wrong sorts of questions, because what they're trying to do is come to a decision about whether you are a credible person, whether they can believe you or not. So they're going to listen to all your answers, even if they're silly answers like, what's your mother's maiden name? My mother's name is Smith. Well, they are going to come to a decision as to whether you're a credible person or not. And if after 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of answering all these silly questions, they decide that you are a person of credibility, then they will be more likely to grant you a protection visa. On the other hand, if they don't think that you're a person of credibility, then they're not going to grant you the protection visa. Now, invariably what happens is the tribunal, the Refugee Review Tribunal, sits there and tries to trick you and tries to catch you out by making what they describe as an inconsistent statement. Now, what that means is, if at the beginning of the tribunal hearing you say that you went to Smithtown Primary School in 1972, and then 5 hours later they say, what primary school did you go to? And you say, I went to Jonestown Primary School. Well, the tribunal will just latch onto that and say, right, well, you've just made an inconsistent statement, and therefore you've been lying. Now, you've been lying about what school you've been going to, and as a consequence, you've been lying about all your claims about persecution. We don't believe any of your stories now, and therefore we're going to reject your protection visa application. Now, if they do that, then that's completely unlawful, and they've made a very bad decision. Now, the fact that you may have said something that's inconsistent doesn't mean that your whole story is a pack of lies. It's not. It's a perfectly normal thing that happens. People who are the subject of persecution have a tendency to suffer from post-traumatic stress, and they can't remember all the things that happened. And as a consequence, there's a tendency for them to make inconsistent statements. The fact that you made an inconsistent statement about your school you went to, or name your mother, or best friend, or anything like that, doesn't mean that you were not persecuted. There's no link between an inconsistent statement and the act of persecution. But the tribunal thinks there is, and if they do, they've made an unlawful decision, and you can challenge that decision in the Federal Circuit Court. But please remember, when you go to the Refugee Review Tribunal, you have to make sure that you've got your story completely straight and don't have any inconsistencies in your story. It's really essential that before you go to the Refugee Review Tribunal, you give them a written statement setting out what happened, when it happened, why it happened. And you need to be as specific as possible. You need to say to them, for example, I was walking down Smith Street on the 7th of November 2012. I walked past, Smith's coffee shop, and 2 men in uniform came up and grabbed me and attacked me and punched me to the ground. This occurred at 10:32, and my friend Jeff and Sarah Smith were there, and they can attest to what happened. All right, so you need to provide as much detail as possible and give that to the tribunal before the tribunal hearing. Now, if you do that, then when they start asking you a whole host of irrelevant questions, then you can say to them, listen, I've covered all this in my statement. The school I went to is at page 2 of my statement. You can have a look at that. If they ask you, what's your mother's maiden name, you can say, right, well, that's covered in page 1 of my statement at paragraph 2. Please have a look at that statement. So the more you do that, the less likely there will be of you making an inconsistent statement. And if you don't make an inconsistent statement, then the tribunal gets very upset because their little game hasn't worked anymore and they can't catch you out. Right? This is all about them trying to trip you up, try and find a way to find an inconsistent statement. If you don't make an inconsistent statement, then the tribunal gets very upset about this because they're actually going to have to do their real job and actually look at the acts of persecution. And they don't want to do that. They simply do not want to look at the claims of acts of persecution because that would mean as soon as they do that, then they're more inclined, I have no option but to grant you a protection visa, and they don't want to do that. So that's really the basis of going to the Refugee Review Tribunal. Now, it's also very important that you get someone to go with you to the Refugee Review Tribunal because you need to get either a solicitor or a registered migration agent to attend the tribunal because he or she can help you and make sure that you don't make an inconsistent statement. Because just trust me on this, if you make an inconsistent statement, you have very, very little chance of ever being granted a protection visa. Conversely, if you have a completely straight story that's not full of holes and is entirely consistent, then you will have a very good chance of getting a protection visa. Now, I'm going to go through just some of the standard questions that is always asked of people who go to the Refugee Review Tribunal. First thing is, how did you leave the country? I left at the airport. I flew out in an aeroplane. Well, did anyone try and stop you or attack you at the airport? No. Well, then they conclude that if you were the subject of persecution, you would have been attacked at the airport or a person of interest to them at the airport, and they've tried to stop you leaving, and as a consequence, you're not a refugee. Well, once again, whether you were attacked or they stopped you or they didn't talk to you or they did or didn't talk to you has got absolutely nothing to do with whether you were persecuted or not. You could have been persecuted and still they did nothing at the airport. Alternatively, you could not have been persecuted and then they may still attend to you or attack you at the airport. So it's an irrelevant consideration for them to raise the issue about what happened at the airport. Now, sometimes another common thing is you may have been attacked in January of 2012, for example, but you didn't leave until April 2012. And they will say, well, why did you take 3 or 4 months to leave before leaving? You know, if you really were persecuted, you would have left straight away. Because you didn't leave straight away, you're not the subject of persecution. Once again, that's completely irrelevant. Completely irrelevant because it has nothing to do with what time you left the country or not. The question is whether you were the subject of persecution irrespective of when you left that country. You could have been the subject of persecution, not left the country for 200 years and still satisfy the criteria. They can't refuse the protection visa because you delayed in leaving the country. All right. Now, a whole host of other issues are also thrown up by the tribunal in an attempt to catch you out. If you were from, say, South Africa, and you claimed you were being persecuted by the South African government, they may ask you the name of the local political representative in your area. Right now, if you don't know the name of your political representative in your local area, then they will conclude that you didn't really have a high political profile, therefore could not be persecuted or not. Once again, that's completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether you know the name of the local political representative or not. The fact that you don't know it doesn't mean you were not the subject of persecution. You could have been the subject of persecution even though you don't know the name of your political representative. So if they ask you this question, then you can say one of two things. You can give them the name of the political representative if you know it, or if you don't know it, say, this question is irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with an act of persecution. So please be aware of these tricks that the Refugee Review Tribunal engage in, and you also need to, if you're going to claim to be a member of a certain political party and you have a membership card for that political party, then please make sure that that document is not a fraudulent document. Now, a lot of people turn up to the tribunal with a membership card and they give it to the tribunal, and the tribunal then goes away and examines it and finds it to be a fake card. Now, then they conclude that because you've given a fake card, therefore your claims are also concocted. Once again, this is irrelevant. A lot of people don't know that their cards are fake, and a lot of countries in Africa don't actually have a membership card, so it's all a bit alien to them. So even if the card is fake, that doesn't mean your claims are fake. They can't conclude that because your card is fake, therefore your claims are fake. But these are all things that, if you have a migration agent representing you, a registered migration agent, she can protect you from these ridiculous assertions. So, as you can see, the tribunal engages in numerous little tactics to try and trick you, and you must be awake up to these tricks. Otherwise, they're just going to refuse your visa. Now, I'm not going to name any names in the tribunal, but the tribunal members know who they are. But suffice to say, there are a number of tribunal members who are never going to grant you a protection visa. You could have clear evidence that you're persecuted. You could have a video of you being attacked and assaulted by members of the army, and you could tender that. You could show that to the tribunal, and even if you showed that to the tribunal, you still would not get your protection visa. So what you've got to do is, when you're at the tribunal, if you think that the tribunal member has already made up his or her mind to refuse your visa, but hasn't actually said, I'm going to refuse your visa, if you think they're being biased towards you, if you think they're acting in a way which is not fair, then you need to say, I think you, member, are being biased, and you need to object to them hearing the matter anymore. Because a lot of tribunal members have made up their mind, even before they walk in the door, to refuse your visa. Now, if you get one of those tribunal members who say that, then you need to object to their continuing to hear the matter at the earliest opportunity. You need to object regularly to their being biased in order to protect yourself, because no matter what you say, you're not going to get the protection visa. Now, all is not lost. If you go to the Refugee Review Tribunal and you lose, then you can appeal to the Federal Circuit Court. But you once again need to get a registered migration agent and or a solicitor to represent you in the court. But you must remember, if the tribunal refuses your application, you need to appeal within a prescribed period of time, which is somewhere between 28 and 35 days. But please don't leave it to the 28th day. If you're going to appeal to the Federal Circuit Court, you need to appeal as early as possible and not leave it to the very last minute. Now, that's about it as far as going to the Refugee Review Tribunal. If you want to come and talk to me about it, you can. My phone numbers are 0411 444 395, and my landline number is 02 6247 9594. My email address is Hugh, HUGHFORD, at optusnet, optusnet.com.au. Now, I hope this is helpful to you, but please be very careful when you go to the tribunal. It's not going to be a bed of roses, so please go in there and listen to what I've said, and at least you'll have a chance of getting a positive outcome. Thank you for your time.